So dissertation defenses are bittersweet for all faculty members. This one may be the most bittersweetest of them all. So Amanda has been part of my lab, part of my life for 11 and a half years. So she came to me in 2011, right out of undergrad with a biochemistry degree. And I was looking for a project coordinator to run a brand new grant. And she had no experience running human research, no experience leading a project, but there was something about her that her confidence, the way she presented herself, the way that we interacted, her intellectual curiosity, all of that just made me want to hire her. And she led that first grant. She led our second grant, and she's still, part of the lab and leading. And this dissertation really represents, a logical extension of all of the time she had in the lab, where she just had so many questions about what we were doing and so much curiosity, and really wanted to take all that she had learned in the time in the lab and build it into something that would be a legacy. So, she'll tell you all about her work, but it's really the end goal of this is to have a brand new scientific measurement tool that we can use to assess this construct that Amanda really spearheaded. So it's just been really amazing to have her part of the lab. Like I said, she's been in the lab a long time. She's had 17 publications, 12 conference presentations, several of them talks. We've been to 8 different states, 3 different countries together. And I'm really excited that because of the work she's doing, we'll be able to continue to collaborate long after she's done. So without further ado, I will stop sharing the slideshow, and we can talk about where these pictures came from later, Katie. And I will turn it over to Amanda.
Thanks, Jen. It's remarkable how much my hair has changed from year to year. Oh, all right. Let me see if I can get this up and running without too much difficulty. So does everyone see a full slide? Beautiful. All right, thanks for joining me today. I'm very excited to share with you my dissertation work, which has been about adolescent eating autonomy. And I'm going to describe defining and measuring this new construct to assess adolescents' autonomous eating behaviors. I'm just going to get rid of all of your beautiful faces. Bear with me 1 second. So first, to begin with some background. Food intake is physiologically controlled in the body in many ways. But the systems that promote the energy balance can also be overridden by many factors, such as the physical properties of food, like its taste or smell, or psychosocial factors like the number of eating partners or pressure to eat in a certain environment. But the period of adolescence has a lot of unique features, which make it very interesting to study in terms of eating behavior. So with adolescent development, the growth and energy needs during this period kind of skyrocket. We also know that it's the period of time where disordered and maladaptive eating behaviors really begin to develop and obesity prevalence begins to rise. I'm particularly interested in the fact that this period of time is marked by a developmentally appropriate shift from parent-directed to more self-directed eating behaviors. And we also know the role of peers and peer influence increases during adolescence. Research has shown that adolescent eating behaviors track into adulthood, and that makes it even more important to study specific eating behaviors at this point. In terms of child and adolescent eating, food preferences during the period are similar, but there are some differences that occur during adolescence. In general, there's a preference for sweet and aversion to bitter foods. And we know that food preferences tend to persist over time, but they can be influenced by repeated exposure. We also know a diet with high variety can track into later stages of life, and that adolescent food preferences are highly influenced by parents' intake and parent modeling, as well as the types of foods available in the home. And finally, in terms of adolescent intake, we know that their choices are not typically made based on health or health values. As I mentioned before, there are some changes between child and adolescent eating patterns. So adolescents have higher calorie intake and may have more frequent snacking and meal skipping. And this could be related and partially due to different shifts in their sleep-wake patterns that occur during adolescence. Also on weekends, we know adolescents eat more fats and sugars and less fruits and vegetables than during the weekdays, and that's similar to what we see with adults. In terms of social eating, adolescents more often eat alone while watching TV and engage less in family meals compared to younger age groups. So as Jen mentioned before, I've worked in the nutrition and health research lab in one way or another for many years. And prior to my dissertation, I worked for 9 years on different eating behavior studies across the lifespan. We noticed, almost all those studies involved what's called a 24-hour dietary recall interview, where a researcher would sit down and ask a participant all the items they ate the previous day, provided in detail, including the type of item, the brand, the size, the amount, etc. And what myself and others noticed is that children and adolescents, had a high, some had a high degree of knowledge and involvement that we didn't expect based on their age. And we also saw vice versa. And that made us curious and made me in particular want to go to literature and see what was being studied about this area. And like I mentioned, well, I didn't mention it yet, but truly there wasn't anything. No one's doing this type of work. We expected and we're noticing apparent differences in eating autonomy. But again, it turned out no one was measuring it, which was a great opportunity for me. So I'd like to take a moment to explain some of the related research areas that I was able to find. In terms of getting us on the same page about terminology, autonomy can be agency or choice in decisions or activities of daily living without interference from another party. But sometimes you'll see that the words autonomy and independence get used interchangeably, and they can both mean agency, but independence can also imply physical separation. So for the rest of today and throughout my dissertation work, I used autonomy to reflect agency and independence to reflect more physical separation from specific people. The related literature areas I was able to identify, there were 3 major areas. The first is general autonomy and development. That's from the psych and development literature. And in this area, we know that parental autonomy support has a large role. So that's where parents are providing specific supportive behaviors to encourage an adolescent's autonomy. We know complete autonomy development is important for healthy self-regulation, but autonomy development hasn't been studied in the feeding domain, or said another way, related to eating behaviors. The second major area of research that has been established involves food parenting practices and parenting styles. Those can be grouped into 3 major areas that I've listed here. And one of those is autonomy support. It includes different behaviors that the parent may provide, like encouraging, educating the child, or providing choices to a child or adolescent. And what's important to note about these first 2 areas that I mentioned is they're both assessed from the parent's perspective or based on parents' actions specifically. The only area of literature that I could find that was related was involving adolescents' independent eating occasions. And the caveat here is those studying this area are looking at adolescents when they're eating completely separate from parents. And as you can imagine, adolescents and parents often spend time together or with parents nearby while adolescents are making their food choices. And so I wanted to make sure that was captured in the complete research area I hope to take on. There's some guiding theories and frameworks that I used throughout my dissertation work, and I'm going to go through them briefly now. The first is the social ecological model, and that presents a broad organizational framework from the individual to the policy levels to help us understand eating different behaviors, but in the case of my work, eating behaviors. So here you can see at the individual level, it's at the core, and the other levels that were pertinent to my work were the interpersonal level, so potential influences of family and friends, and the organizational level could be relating to the school environment or eating in a restaurant setting. Then the next theory that guided this work is self-determination theory. So that's been identified as a valuable framework to help study individuals' motivation to engage in a particular behavior. And so that establishes that human motivation requires these three main components, autonomy being one of them. So when thinking about adolescent eating, we know that someone must feel volition or agency and perceive value before they're willing to engage in a specific behavior. And then finally, the food choice process model. So seen here, it's adapted from Connors et al., the reference included at the bottom. So this model's thought, the food choice process is thought to be really individualized, and throughout the life course, different factors interact and go into one's personal food system. At any given point, someone has to negotiate those values. So you might be thinking about the taste of the food versus the health in order to make the ultimate food choice. So through the background literature that I examined, I was able to address or identify four main gaps that my work hopes to address. So autonomy development has not been examined in the feeding domain, and adolescent autonomy and eating behavior are often examined, if they are, from the parent perspective. I wasn't able to find a validated instrument that captures adolescent eating autonomy to date. And finally, we know that a lot of generalizations are made about adolescent eating behavior, but we don't really know as much about factors that influence adolescents' eating decisions. In terms of my dissertation work in the department, we organized the dissertation based on 3 papers. I used some icons to help keep us organized throughout the discussion today, but you'll see here, I have used 2 studies across 3 aims. So my first study, aim 1, aims to qualitatively assess adolescents' perceptions of their food choices and identify different emergent food-related behaviors across contexts. In the second paper, study 2, aim 1, I used ecological momentary assessment to characterize adolescents' control over their food and drink choices. And then in the third paper, study 2, aim 2, I laid out the process of creating and refining and pilot testing a new survey to evaluate adolescents' eating autonomy. The process of scale development and validation is very detailed and extensive. And so based on the reference paper here that I followed for my dissertation work, there are 3 main phases and 9 steps. So you can see here in dark blue, the first phase is item development. Medium blue, the second phase is scale development. And in black, the third phase is scale evaluation. My dissertation included most of the first half of these steps, and I'll continue to use these icons throughout the talk to help us stay organized as well. So in study 1, aim 1, my first aim was to identify the predominant or the most common factors involved in adolescents' food choices across different contexts. And then I also wanted to identify any themes about control that adolescents have over their eating. The main goal was to qualitatively explore autonomous eating and/or independent food and drink choices towards developing a survey. And the steps there would be domain identification and item generation, which I'll get into in a minute. So in this first phase that I talked about, scale development, that's item generation. It's comprised of 2 parts. And domain identification means we need to define the boundaries and purpose of the domain and describe the conceptual definition. So I have to define the boundaries of eating autonomy and give it a definition. How might I accomplish this? Well, best practice says I should use deductive and inductive methods in order to do so. An example of deductive methods means consult the literature, check for existing surveys and see what's out there. But then inductive methods are exploratory research methods, which can use focus groups or interviews to gather more information from your target population or group. So that's exactly what I did. In the first study, I used focus groups of adolescents in Western New York to learn more about their eating behavior. I facilitated all of the focus groups, and they were co-facilitated by Arturo Gregory and our group. We used a moderator guide that was informed by the food choice process model, and it had open-ended questions to facilitate conversation. encourage discussion. So the topics on that guide included influences on food choices across settings and choices made with or without parents or guardians. It involved, it asked about adolescents' involvement in their food purchasing and preparation, and to identify circumstances where they felt more or less control over their food choices. We audio recorded our focus groups and had them transcribed, then coded by 3 independent coders using deductive and inductive code creation and thematic analysis. You can see our study was actually published in early 2021 in Frontiers in Psychology. So if you're interested in taking a closer look at the results, feel free, here's some information. But in terms of sample characteristics, we had 35 adolescents participate, about half were female, and we had a reasonable distribution by racial, ethnic, and geographic background that's representative of the Western New York area. The first area of results I'll be presenting are factors that adolescents identified as impacting their food and drink choices most often. So we found 6 factors that were the most often discussed that adolescents said impacted their food choices. They were schedule, availability, convenience, healthfulness, hunger, and physical activity. But what was most interesting is when we organized those around the social ecological model. So in terms of the home, school, restaurant, and store, when they were discussing such factors, we found that different factors emerged as prominent based on the setting. So in terms of the home environment, only those most common factors that I previously mentioned were dominant in the discussion. Here's a sample quote. One adolescent explained how they packed their lunch. So, quote, for me, it's usually like what I have, because normally I expect a sandwich or a side. Usually it's yogurt for me because that's just always what we have in our house. So really, I just pack what's like available to me, you know? You can see the adolescent language really coming through too. In terms of the school environment, the food quality, taste, and variety emerged as distinct factors that were important when making choices in this environment. So here's a supporting quote. Teens often shared their reasons for choosing not to eat food from school. Quote, I bring my lunch every day because the school food is really nasty. Then in the restaurant setting, we found that cost and openness to new foods dominated. Participants made cost-based decisions when eating with friends compared to family. So, quote, I usually order something cheaper. I would get like 5 chicken wings or something instead of what I would order with my family. Other adolescents mentioned that when dining at restaurants with family, they felt they had actually more independence when eating with friends. So to quote, just get what I want when eating among friends. And then eating at a restaurant with peers was cited as an opportunity to try new foods. Quote, that's when I try new stuff. When I'm not with my parents or my family, I'm like, oh, that looks good, let me try it. And finally, the store environment. In that environment, cost was also an important factor. So some mentioned shopping without parents at grocery stores in the context of being able to buy what they want without parent approval. And others mentioned grocery shopping with friends in preparation for a hangout. So quote, whenever me and my friend hang out, we go to a grocery store. It's like the only time I buy food for myself. Then the next aim of the work was to identify those emergent themes related to adolescents' eating behaviors. And I found 5 main areas of autonomous eating behaviors that adolescents may have a range of involvement in. They are meal planning, food preparation and cooking, grocery planning and shopping, independent food acquisition, and independent food purchasing. And here are some relevant quotes from our focus groups to highlight the adolescent perspective. In terms of food preparation and cooking, adolescents will make something quick, like grilled cheese or mac and cheese, often with items that require minimal preparation, like like frozen chicken fingers or something frozen, like frozen veggies. Pardon me. When self-preparing foods, their choices are often based on availability in the home, and they'll make, quote, whatever's in the kitchen to cook. Food acquisition. So in our study, we found 40% of participants indicated that they coordinated their own transportation in some way to obtain food or drinks. Walking and public transit were the most commonly mentioned. And in terms of food purchasing, 2/3 of our sample discussed their use of personal spending money, either provided of their own money or provided by a parent. And when adolescents were purchasing things directly, they described being more cost conscious. So often buying items that were cheaper, something, quote, something that's going to last me a long time, such as a big box of ramen. Through this analysis, we were also able to identify some potential enhancements or infringements on adolescent eating autonomy. And an example of an enhancement might be having more independent time, and an infringement might be parental control or restriction behaviors. So to summarize what I found in study 1, there were many influences on food choice beyond taste and convenience. Plus, we found that some of these factors had a different prominence based on specific environments. Also, perceived control differed by the eating location, occasion, and social context of eating. And finally, the study helped us refine the definition of eating autonomy. So instead of just believing it to be food choices and control perceptions, we realized that it was also comprised of these autonomous food behaviors that adolescents have a range of involvement in. So the next step from here is item development of that adolescent eating autonomy survey that'll help us actually be able to measure eating autonomy. Just gonna take a quick sip of water before discussing the second study. So moving on to study 2, that's split into 2 aims. So I'm going to discuss the majority of the methods now, since they are consistent for both of the studies, or papers, I should say. So in study 2, aim 1, I aim to characterize adolescents' control over their food and drink choices over a week period and across contexts using ecological momentary assessment. I also had an exploratory aim to examine adolescents' food choices during their autonomous eating occasions. For this, I had 3 hypotheses. First, that eating autonomy would be greater for older adolescents on the weekends, during snack occasions, and when eating alone or with friends or peers. Second, I believed adolescent autonomy over food choices would vary across the time of day. And third, I hypothesized that autonomous eating occasions would be associated with a lower likelihood of eating fruits and vegetables, but a higher likelihood of adolescents eating packaged snacks or desserts. So what is ecological momentary assessment? Well, it's a tool that uses mobile technology to help capture information over changing contexts. So you can use the technology to send a survey to a participant and repeatedly assess some sort of real world criteria. The nice thing about it is you're assessing things very close to the actual event in which they happen. Some of the advantages are that you can have a lot of data capture in a short amount of time, and it reduces certain types of bias. And one example is recall bias, since you're assessing so close to the actual event. Research has been done in using EMA for both adult and child studies so far in terms of eating behavior. So while EMA can be applied to many research areas, it is feasible and has been used in eating behavior assessment. To accomplish this, there's 3 different types of responses you can use through the EMA technology. There's signal contingent responses, which are prompted at random or on a semi-random schedule. Event contingent, where the participant would initiate their own survey, such as telling them every time they eat a meal to complete a survey. Or interval contingent, so that's prompted at the same time each day. One of the things to note with EMA use in children and adolescents is compliance is a little bit lower than we've seen in adults, around 77%. In study 2, we had we engaged adolescents between 12 and 17 years of age that had a personal smartphone, and we split the group. So we wanted to recruit half the population split by age and half by gender. So half were younger adolescents and half were older adolescents. All right, I'll help walk you through. So in terms of our study methods, There was an initial visit where participants answered questionnaires. They did our in-house test survey, the Adolescent Eating Autonomy Survey, and a complementary survey battery. Then we demonstrated how to use the EMA program that we had set up. So this is what it would look like. You would get a text prompt to your phone, and then this would be the first question you'd see. Did you eat or drink anything in the last 3 hours other than water? If you said no, the survey would end because it used question logic. Otherwise, if you said yes, you'd be prompted with the following questions. And I'll get into detail about those in a moment. But altogether, the survey only took a minute or so to complete. All participants were assessed for 2 full weekend days and 5 weekdays. And we used the UB REDCap program and individual cell phone messenger application to collect this data. In terms of the 7-day EMA data collection, we used 5 signal contingent responses, which were programmed to go out every 2 to 3 hours pseudo-randomly based on the schedule on the side of the screen. Once we sent that link to a phone, it lasted for 60 minutes before expiring. If you logged on later than that, you just get a thank you message that said, stay tuned for another prompt later today. We also sent 1 event contingent response per day, which was at bedtime. We sent a reminder 30 minutes prior to the scheduled bedtime. But if you chose to go to bed at 2 a.m. instead of 10 a.m. or 10 p.m., no problem, the link didn't expire. The EMA survey questions went on to ask about the most recent eating or drinking occasion in the past 3 hours. It asked participants to write in items consumed, the type of eating occasion, and if the adolescent had selected the food items themselves, which was of our main interest. They also would answer questions about the physical and social setting in which they were eating and the reasons they chose the food or drink at that time, as well as if they self-prepared or self-purchased any of the items. For these analyses, we used general linear mixed models, and all analyses were done in SPSS 28. In terms of our eating autonomy assessment, the dependent variable for all of the independent tests was the report of autonomous eating occasion. So whether they selected it themselves or someone else selected the food for them at that time. The independent tests were based on fixed factors such as age and gender, or situational factors like I mentioned in my hypotheses. So time of day, week part, eating occasion, eating company, and whether they had prepared any part of the meal on their own. Then for the autonomous food category selections, we ran similar models, but the dependent variable was reversed. So in this case, the dependent variable was the actual food items that participants ate. So let's say they wrote in that they ate chicken salad, a cookie, an apple, and water. A coder went through and coded the foods into umbrella categories as seen here. And we tested yes or no whether they ate a food from that category against whether that was reported as an autonomous eating occasion or not. In this sample, we had 48 adolescents, half younger, half older, just over 50% female from highly educated and predominantly white backgrounds. There were no differences in the demographic categories by age group. Overall, we had great compliance in our study, 87%, with no differences across the different types of survey prompts that I talked about or across the study period. Then in terms of eating occasion descriptive data, so we were able to capture over 1,700 discrete surveys that represented almost 1,000 unique eating occasions across all of our adolescents. In 65% of those eating occasions, adolescents selected the food or drink themselves, and in about 40%, adolescents cooked or self-prepared those meals. In terms of eating occasion type, of all the surveys submitted, 65% reflected meals according to the adolescents, and 31% reflected snacks. For eating company, and 52% of those eating occasions, they indicated that parents were present, 28% alone, and 18% occurred in the company of friends or peers. And then by location, The home represented 81% of eating occasions, followed by 6% of the occasions at school and 13% in other locations outside of the home and school. But the next section of results are based on the multi-level modeling analysis. So here on the left, you can see the fixed and situational factors that were tested. So I found that the odds of making autonomous food selections were higher during snacks and during self-prepared meal occasions compared to the reference. Then we also tested various combinations of eating company and found that eating alone was always related to an increased odds of that being an autonomous eating occasion, and eating with any social company was related to a reduced odds of an autonomous eating occasion. But interestingly, when comparing eating with friends to eating with parents, it wasn't statistically different. Then I tested the variation across the time of day and found that 2 of the time points assessing the evening hours were associated with a reduced odds of, or reduced likelihood of there being an autonomous eating occasion. And you can see here on this graph that the time periods assessing what is essentially the 3:30 to 9:30 p.m. window had the lowest average frequency of autonomous eating occasions. The next section of results are those for the exploratory analysis of food choices made during independent eating occasions. I found that the consumption of vegetables, protein foods, and mixed dishes was associated with a lower odds of them being autonomously selected, while consumption of packaged snacks was associated with the increased odds of autonomous eating. So these data suggest some adolescent eating occasions are associated with convenience food intake. So the end of study 2, aim 1 in summary is the odds of autonomous food choice did not vary by adolescent age group, contrary to my hypothesis. I found a higher odds of making autonomous food choices during snacking occasions, when eating alone, and when self-preparing meals, but a reduced odds of making autonomous food choices when eating with parents or friends and during those after school and evening time points. Finally, autonomous eating occasions were associated with reduced odds of consuming vegetables, protein foods, and mixed dishes, but an increased odds of consuming packaged foods. And this takes me back to our study frame and organization. So paper 3, again, draws from the same methods, but there are some specific methods related to this process of creating and refining the survey that I'll go into detail on now. But first, the primary aim of this work was to describe the process of creating, refining, and pilot testing this new survey to evaluate adolescent eating autonomy. And secondarily, I wanted to test the associations between cross-sectional eating autonomy responses on the survey to that EMA data that I just described in the same sample. The goal here is to produce a useful measure of adolescent eating autonomy that can be used across other researchers and to ensure high standards of validity. So as I mentioned before, we'll use this organizational tool to see where we've been and where we're going to go next. So next up is content validity. To examine content validity, you can use 2 sub-steps with evaluation by the target population or evaluation by experts. The purpose of using target population evaluation is that the lived experience of the person or the intended audience can really be considered. I used 3 sub-steps. So I had items assessed by a group of adolescents and research team members after we wrote our survey. Then I conducted 2 semi-structured interviews with parents to check that their real-world experience of their adolescents' autonomy development was captured. I wasn't necessarily missing any ideas. And then I engaged 6 adolescents to participate in individual field pre-tests. What was the result of this work? Well, I was able to identify poorly worded items, change any vague prompts or missing answer choices. And then altogether, we made those changes to minimize misunderstanding. Then we moved on to evaluation by experts. The purpose here is to ensure content relevance, representativeness, and technical quality. In the end, I had 5 researchers complete my survey. They were from the adolescent development, eating behavior, and child obesity fields. They rated each survey item independently on relevance on a 4-point scale, but they were also able to write in their feedback on questions. So I got individual feedback on every item as well as the Likert scoring. So item scoring, an average of less than 2.9, which is quite relevant, were flagged to be removed from the survey. And then finally got to the end of the item development phase. And at that point, we had created a broad survey with item development informed by our formative work using age appropriate and inclusive language, and had 67 total items. This brings us to the next stage of item development, or moved past item development onto scale development. The first thing I did under scale development was administer it in a test sample. This gets at the secondary aim I talked about. I wanted to test the associations between the survey items that I had developed and the ecologically collected eating behavior data that I previously described in the last aim. And again, this is in a similar design, the same study design in the same sample. I won't go into the details. So the aims for this, my analyses and hypotheses for this aim, in terms of the exploratory analyses, here are the age group. I was interested in looking at age group differences in survey responses. I was also looking to make ecological comparisons. So for the age group differences, I used ANOVA or chi-square, and ecological comparisons, Pearson correlations. But what I want to note is that the outcome measure was different in this analysis. We collapsed all the data for eating occasions into a single proportion that measured adolescents' frequency of making autonomous eating occasions over 7 days. I know that's a mouthful. In terms of my hypotheses, so for the age group differences, I believe there would be differences in age based on their preference for food choice autonomy, how often they ate with friends or peers and or alone, how often they self-prepared meals or snacks or used the oven, how often they independently purchased items, and how much knowledge the parents of those adolescents had about their independent eating. Then in terms of ecological comparisons, with the EMA data, I thought there would be positive associations between control over food choices, frequency of self-selection, eating inside the kitchen, or sorry, outside the kitchen at home, eating alone, the frequency of meal and snack preparation, it's a mouthful, and using the oven to cook, as well as eating with a friend. And then I proposed negative correlations between frequency of eating with a parent or guardian, being told what to eat, parental knowledge of independent eating occasions, and parental food selection preference with the ecological data. So again, I know it's a lot, but I'll try to walk you through. In terms of this first section of results, this includes the hypothesis tests for the age group differences in our survey, new survey items that we were testing. So despite my hypotheses, our age-based items found few significant differences in responses between older and younger adolescents. I found that younger adolescents ate more often with a friend inside their home than younger adolescents. I'm sorry, younger adolescents did more than older adolescents. And in terms of spending their own money, not provided by a parent or guardian, older adolescents were more willing to spend their own money on food. Finally, found that older adolescents desired a higher amount of control over their food and drink choices compared to younger adolescents. Next up are the hypothesis tests for positive correlations between the survey items we developed and that EMA calculated autonomy value that I told you about before. We found that the frequency of self-preparing dinner and being responsible for selecting or preparing food or drinks for themselves at home were positively associated with EMA calculated eating autonomy. And the final section of results shows the hypothesized negative correlations between survey items and that EMA calculated eating autonomy. So in line with my hypotheses, we found that the frequency of parental behaviors such as limiting food choices and telling adolescents what to eat were negatively associated with EMA collected eating autonomy. Finally, item reduction. In this phase, we were able to revise and reduce the 67 items on the survey by making answer choices more uniform and streamlining wording. Through the expert review feedback, we were able to focus on adolescent eating behaviors in the survey and take out a lot of the questions that also muddied in the environmental questions. And we've reduced the number of overall items on the scale. There were a couple areas that the experts felt we had missed, and so 4 new items were added based on that feedback. And this takes us to the end of what I have contributed so far to the process of scale development and validation. To summarize, I found few age group differences in eating behavior survey questions. Older adolescents didn't report having more control over their food choices, but they did want more control than younger adolescents did. Overall, control over food choices, those items were not associated with EMA collected eating autonomy data in the other analysis, but certain behaviors were specifically related to preparing and selecting foods and preparing dinner. And then only parental control behaviors had negative relationships with the EMA calculated eating autonomy score. Now I'd like to bring these analyses together and talk about the bigger picture. So through these adolescent eating behavior studies, we learned that eating autonomy is not just about perceived control over adolescents' food choices or what they're, quote, allowed to do. Instead, it's important to understand one's agency in various eating behaviors and take a closer look at things like the frequency of purchasing certain foods, lunch packing, cooking, etc. I also found that adolescents do perceive a generally high amount of food choice autonomy, despite even being with their parents and in the home environment often. So through these studies, I've also established that eating autonomy varies considerably across participants and across time of day and based on inter and interpersonal factors. Finally, found that any social company may reduce the experience of autonomous food choice. These dissertation studies had many strengths. And the first is that engaged adolescents directly to provide insight about their own behaviors. It proposed, outlined, and tested a new survey that targets the unique developmental considerations of adolescents. And it avoided focusing on healthy or unhealthy eating and instead just examined autonomy across the entire diet. Finally, it used mixed methods approaches, which was really exciting to learn new techniques and, well, I'll get into more of that later. As far as limitation goes, the studies were restricted by the following. In study 2, AIMS 1 and 2, the sample had minimal socioeconomic and racial ethnic diversity. Also, we were not able, the study sample that I used tested my 67 item measure survey. Now that we've done item reduction, it's down to 30 something items. And so it'll need to undergo further testing, which I'll explain in a moment. And then some of our data may reflect more time spent at home than under normal circumstances due to that COVID-19 context. So in the near future, we're going to perform a large data collection with 200 to 300 adolescents to look at the properties of this revised adolescent eating autonomy survey. And I hope through that we can complete the phase 3 of scale validation that I showed you earlier today. So that will help ensure we have a sound scale with strong validity and reliability. I also would like to replicate the data collection post COVID-19. And then the more so distant future, I'd like to see this survey used more widely so that we can cross-sectionally and longitudinally examine adolescent eating behaviors and see which ones might be more stable or dynamic across adolescents. And then incorporating this survey into other studies will give us a sense of what adolescent eating autonomy relationships there might be to other health statuses and eating behaviors like diet quality and obesity. I believe that assessing adolescent eating autonomy is improving our understanding of adolescent health and development. And based on this work, we now know a little bit more about how adolescents make their food choices and why. Now, I wanted to take a moment to use a public health framework and the social ecological model to think about how adolescent eating autonomy, and considering that, may be able to influence health behavior change related to adolescent eating behavior. So here's an example. We know that adolescents' decisions are most often based on convenience and availability, and most of adolescent eating occurs in the home. So we can identify potentially modifiable eating environment factors that make autonomous choices of higher diet quality. Some examples might be engaging adolescents in grocery planning. That allows for adolescents to feel that agency and volition and choice earlier in the food choice process, and increasing the household availability of packaged snacks and convenience foods of higher diet quality, so that when adolescents are making autonomous choices, again, the environment's a little bit regulated to promote those. So we think other future interventions could work to increase the quality of food choices when adolescents are selecting their own food, but it's important to consider when they're with the parents and without. There's a lot of potential here. I'd now like to take some time for acknowledgements. So I'm very fortunate to have had the support of many individuals to get to this point. I wanted to first thank my committee for their mentorship and guidance throughout the many dissertation stages. I'd also like to thank those that helped complete the research, such as the research assistants and former graduate students who assisted me in the project, as well as our funding source. Next, I wanted to thank the departments of Community Health and Health Behavior and Nutrition and Exercise Science. The students, faculty, and staff in these departments have helped encourage and guide me along the way. And it's all been a lot more enjoyable because of you. So finally, I also wanted to extend gratitude to my current boss and coworkers at the Primary Care Research Institute for supporting me in my graduate school endeavors. But wait, there's a lot more specific gratitude to share. I have, as Jen mentioned at the outset, I've been in the Nutrition Health Research Lab for 12 years. I'm incredibly fortunate to have worked at a place with such positive and energetic coworkers for such a long time. And I'm grateful for the training I received and the people that helped along the way. In particular, I've met some of my best friends through working in the lab, and I'll forever cherish you all. This is where I can't keep a straight face to my mentor and friend, Jen. Thanks for everything over the past decade. You've helped mold me into a great researcher, modeled how to be a well-rounded, warm, badass woman in science in ways that I hope to emulate. I also wanted to thank you for allowing me to leave dirty dishes in the lab sink consistently for years without much criticism, and I'm sure not washing those dishes on time helped me to be more efficient in other ways. To the friends near and far who helped make doctoral, working parent, pandemic, life bearable and successful, thank you. I couldn't have remained sane without your friendship. And now for my family. I appreciate you not laughing at me every time I decided to go back to school for another degree. I promised Jason that this time would be the last time for sure, I think. My love for school probably started in my infant years, and my family's been encouraging me to learn and grow on my own, at my own pace ever since. And then Jason, one of the greatest gifts you've given me is giving me the space and time to achieve my goals. Thanks for always being solid, a grounding force for our family, and giving 110% when I didn't have 110% to give. believe it or not. And I've been told by mentors in the department I should not give this blanket advice to other people. Having a family that I want to spend quality time with has been the single best motivation to keep me on track and marching toward the finish line for my dissertation. And we made it. Thanks for your time today. I look forward to your questions.
Can you go back a few slides? So that I want to.
Which one?
Wait, stop. This one. This picture right here with all of us in the cap and gown is photoshopped. Everyone but me is wearing the exact same gown. This is a very elaborate picture that we took.
Yeah.
This is our lab regalia.
Photo credit, Adam Grayson.
Okay. Now we can do the serious part where people ask you questions.
Whoops, there we are. Should I keep the slides up?
Yeah, Amanda's going to make you go back and ask you something about statistics.
I am not. Excellent presentation, Amanda. Thank you so much. And I especially loved your detailed methods description. It's very clear you've been in research for a very long time to describe it so clearly and run so many complex studies. I'm going to ask what is an obvious question for me. I know you didn't have the power to assess this in depth, but I'm curious if in your interviews or in some of your data in your second study, if you had any beginning impressions of what household resources might do to these relationships or these kids.
I didn't, Amanda, and it's definitely a limitation that we want to look at in upcoming studies. So one of the goals I know for my collaborations with Jen is that she hopes to incorporate this content area into a study that's about to kick off in a month or so. And that's looking at resources specifically. So hopefully we'll have an answer to your question in a couple of years.
Awesome, thank you.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I think you did a very, very, very good job. Probably the best dissertation defense I've ever seen. So
I don't have a question, but I echo that.
All my people are here. Does anybody have a question? I'm searching for raised hands to try and.
Hi, Amanda, it's Mom. I'm very proud of you. Thanks for sticking to what your heart believed in.
Thanks, Mom.
You're welcome.
You know how to mute now?
I do.
All right, there's a million people on the Zoom. Does anyone have a question? I'm sure Amanda would love for everyone to keep telling her how great she did, but
No, please don't.
she's also here to answer questions. No one? This for my class, I would just keep staring at you, but until somebody asks a question. But we don't
yeah,
have
I'll ask a question.
okay.
I'm crying harder than I cried during my own defense, which is funny, but
For context, Amanda and I showed up and surprised Katie at her own defense, and she had no idea we were coming.
So you mentioned that, COVID-19 is impacted this and that's a future direction. How do you think that, let's say we live in a world where COVID-19 no longer exists and we're no longer in, having any ramifications from COVID. What do you think would be different?
I do think there'll be a higher frequency of seeing adolescents eat, certainly in school. During the time of my second study, there was a combination of in-person, hybrid, and remote learning. So I think that definitely reduced that eating setting. So school specifically. Also, in general, maybe more restaurant eating. I can't be certain of that. I think we need to replicate this or repeat, not even replicate, but repeat it in a larger sample, as I mentioned before, because then we'll be able to see other patterns. One of the things that was interesting in the focus groups is the potential for seasonal variation, especially in Western New York, with autonomy behaviors. And we won't be able to tell that until we have a larger data set. But again, I conducted the EMA analysis in January and February. So if you can imagine, not only might there have been more eating at home because of COVID, but maybe more eating at home because of the weather, and just less freedom to walk and take public transit. So I don't want to make too many assumptions, but definitely I do think there would be more eating in school with certainty, and potentially more eating at restaurants and other establishments. Like previous work also showed adolescents often got food at places that we might not necessarily think about, like corner stores, gas stations, dollar stores. And so I think we'd see more of that.
One thing I didn't think about until you mentioned this is how potentially living through COVID together may have shaped how parents address these things. So potentially, you know, parents and adolescents spent a lot more time together than either of them wanted to. And maybe parents, you know, had more control than they previously would have, and how, you know, as we move out of that, how it might be different.
I also think parents may have said, do whatever you want, given how the high rate that I saw adolescents felt they were making their own food choices despite being home or with parents. So yeah, a lot more to look at here. It's exciting.
Amanda, can you see the raised hands? Julie and Lorraine both have their hands
I
up.
can't.
Julie
Whoever
was
wants to go
first.
next.
So
Yeah,
Julie,
I just
go.
wanted to follow up on Katie's question. I had some questions about COVID too. And did you collect any data to try to sort of understand how people were, you know, being impacted by COVID? Like, did you ask like if they were in person, if they were, you know, hybrid with school, and did you do any exploratory analyses?
We didn't. We did collect the data. I used a subscale from one of the CDC surveys about COVID impacts in general. So we have those survey responses kind of globally, well, cross-sectionally. And then at the end of every day, so that bedtime survey prompt did include some general questions about the logistics of their day. So did they leave the house? There are some like very fine caveats to that though. We asked if they left the house for more than 30 minutes. The phrasing wasn't ideal in how we asked it. We asked if they were home alone for any period of time, and if they left for sports, school, etc. So I do have those data points, but we didn't examine them.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Lorraine?
Yes, thank you. So I understand all the limitations, and I want to compliment you on just all the methodologies that you used, including EMA, which you know I love. One of the things that you mentioned as a limitation that I'd like to hear more about, kind of next steps to address, is the social class and ethnic makeup of your sample.
Yeah.
We really can't say that this
It's
these
generalizable.
results generalize,
Yeah.
So in the upcoming study, to the extent that you're going to be involved or Jen's going to be involved, what are the plans to seek to address that very, very important, well, those actually, because it's class and ethnicity,
No problem.
those
So-
very important limitations?
Jen has 2 studies in with IRB right now. I think they're actually both approved, but the specific survey validation, which wouldn't include any other methods other than the test survey in about 250 adolescents, aims to be a demographic match, right? So we want to be representative of the population across backgrounds. Parents will provide family demographic information at the screening. And so we will have those assessment points. And so I think we'll be more certain at that point that we can balance the groups before our data analysis. In my case, we were limited, like I said before, by the COVID-19 context and financial limitations of our grant funding. So we just kind of had to move forward. With my study in particular, I do believe that the technology needs, the technology requirements were a limiting factor that pushed me towards that bias sample, Lorraine. So because I required participants during COVID to have the internet technology to answer my survey at home for the first visit, do a remote Zoom visit, and also have a personal smartphone with data, I do think that that bias, who was able to participate. I'm so curious to see once we extend this, if there are demographic differences, and I would imagine there are in eating autonomy. The other study that Jen already has funding for I believe the upcoming 3 or 4 years is specifically stratified based on resource scarcity. So I'm proud to say that we'll be able to address your questions, and we've already been thinking about it.
All right.
That sample is
thank you.
also stratified by race, ethnicity, Lorraine. So
Okay.
we should have a much better understanding of how this survey tracks in a broad range of both economic and racial ethnic populations.
Right, because your first study seemed fairly representative, and then the other study lost that, but understandable under COVID and given the tech requirements and so forth. So excellent job, Amanda.
Thanks, Lorraine.
Okay, so we're a little bit after noon. I don't see any other raised hands. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. This was really an amazing turnout. Like there's like an arrow and there's like more and more and more little boxes in people's faces. So thank you for coming, and we're going to ask everyone to get off except for Amanda's committee and Amanda's committee. If you need to run to the bathroom or whatever, do it now. And then we'll get back on and chat.
I'm gonna run. We'll be back.
Great job, Amanda.
Great job.